we are absolutely delighted to welcome you today to the fifth and the final installment this spring of the sessions of Territory under the heading Materials or Urbanism as Material Accumulation. As you know, it's a highlight of our work of many years. We have a special guest and more about that in a second. So we have started, this session is especially in the sense that it was also the first time co-curated between the two schools, ETH Zurich and Harvard Graduate School of Design. And my thanks goes to Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, assistant professor at the GSD, and Hans Hortig, doctoral candidate at ETH. Thank you for the fabulous collaboration. And special welcome once again to the GSD students. It's fantastic that we can have an auditorium between at least two schools, but in fact there are many more guests today. And warm welcome to our speaker, our guest star this afternoon, Tsing, anthropologist and professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Today tuning in from Connecticut. And it is a fantastic honor, Anna. Thank you for making the time and for making the effort. And we also have with us Marija Marić, architect and designer, ETH alumni, of course. Marija is ours, but she is now at Uni Luxembourg. And we also have Nils Güttler, historian and ETH researcher at DGS. So they join us as respondents. Thank you so much. All guests will be introduced in a moment in more detail. So for those of you, there are perhaps more guests today who have not joined us previously. Just a few contours of this, let's say, seminar project. We have started, I think, about 3 years ago. This is our 6th iteration with the main question to address the future of urbanism, of urban design, territorial design. If these spatial disciplines should keep the relevance in the future, what should be their main concerns and their main characteristics? Under this term, urbanism, we have understood a range of related fields, from urban and landscape design to research to spatial practices, including activism and the arts. And we also understand the extended sense of this practice and the broader perspective from cities to urbanizing territories and eventually to our, let's say, planetary life as a whole. So let me just say, Hans, if you want to share our poster, I will say a few words about the guests we have seen this spring. So in considering materials and material flows and material accumulation, we have in fact debated material cultures of architecture and urbanism and spatial practices of material use from those sites of resource extraction to the construction sites and to the spaces of everyday life. Can we possibly reimagine material cultures and practices through the agency of design? This was one of the core questions, and it was debated in different ways with all of our guests. So we have seen interesting, fabulous lectures, first by Joshua Komarov, who put the focus on the notion of islands and islandness as new geographies of power and exclusion that can influence much of the material landscapes and flows around them. In the second session, we heard from Carola Hein, who postulated oil as the primary, or oil and petroleum as the kind of primary resources of our civilization. We then spoke with Sarah Nichols, who illuminated the socio-metabolist history of concrete. That is probably then the second most pervasive material on which the modern life is built. And in the fourth session, we heard Jane Hutton, on the reciprocal landscapes of wood and steel, linking the kind of iconic design sites of New York with their sites of origin in Latin America and other places. So I will now invite my colleagues and co-curators, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes and Hans Hortig, to tell you a few more words about our collaboration and to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Milica, and I will just be very brief because you already explained very well what the sessions on territory were trying to do, and it was great to be able to somehow use the silver linings of that of our current, let's say, online condition to join forces to address this question of material accumulation and materials. So this is part of a class that I teach at the GSD on material world, which is basically aiming at linking design professions with their kind of extractivist responsibility, and to establish a picture of the ways that this intersection is related to the global enterprise of extractive neoliberalism. So we looked at wood, concrete, brick, and iron in our class, and we were, of course, delighted to read and to study the work of Tsing as a kind of almost like meta manner of addressing all of these questions, and the political economy of these construction materials grounded in this kind of extractive processes. So we produced a video, and we might be able to share it with you in the near future. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, as Marić mentioned earlier, we are part of the Unseen fan club, so we're really excited to listen to her talk and be able to discuss also with the audience today. So I would leave it to Hans to pick up.
Hello, also a brief welcome from my side. I'm honored to introduce today Anna Tsing. She's teaching anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her academic work investigates local ramifications of global supply chain operations, multi-species entanglements, and the feral effects of what she has been calling the Patchy Anthropocene. Before joining the faculty at the UC Santa Cruz, she was a visiting assistant professor at the University of Colorado and an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts. She has also been a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, Harvard University, and the Aarhus University. One of her recent books is The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. And in 2020, she published the collaborative online project, The Feral Atlas, which we are going to hear about today. As respondents, we are glad to have with us today Marić. Marija is an architect and researcher currently working as a postdoc associate at the Master in Architecture program, University of Luxembourg. She holds a PhD from the Institute of History and Theory of Architecture from the ETH Zurich. Her work explores the production of built environment and urban imaginaries in the intersection with economy, politics, and media. And as a second respondent, we have Nils Güttler with us. Nils is a historian of science at the chair of science studies at the ETH Zurich. His research interest ranges from history of life science, especially biogeography and ecology, the history of popular science and visual culture, to environmental history. He holds a PhD from the Humboldt University in Berlin and the Max Planck Institute. His doctoral research concentrated on mapping practices in 19th century plant geography. And at the ETH Zurich, Nils focuses on a project that explores the environmental and non-human history of the Frankfurt airport. And this is embedded and related to his broader research interests in infrastructures and their hybrid ecologies. So without further delay, I'm happy to leave the floor, give the floor to Anna Tsing, and look forward to the presentation and the discussion today.
Thank you so much. Can I go ahead and share? Yes, okay, good. It's really an honor to get to speak to this group, and just hearing a little about the research of some of the folks who are hosting me here just makes me hungry to hear more. I'm going to talk about what I've been working on for the last 5 years, entitled Feral Atlas, the More Than Human Anthropocene. And it's a digital project, and it already appears online at feralatlas.org. That's a mistake on the slide that I made. It's actually feralatlas.org. Please ignore that. I'm talking to you about a project that's already appeared because I think it can still offer some insights about how to study the Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch in which humans have become a major geological force. The slide you see is one of 4 that architect Fei-Fei Zhou has included on our site. And we call this one acceleration to refer to the great acceleration, the period since World War II, in which both Earth systems and human social indicators have shot up crazily. At the center, you see a clot of marine garbage viewed from below. The non-management of waste is an important characteristic of the Great Acceleration, and we emphasize that feature. Okay. I don't know how to advance. Okay, that did it. Here's a higher scale with a new element. There's a pig farm next to a nuclear power plant, next to a plantation and a grocery store, and above it, a monstrous Philippine manananggal added by Filipinx artists Enzo Camacho and Amy Lin. As you see, we're jumping not only into design collaborations, but also across worlds, scales, places, and kinds of activities. The drawing creates a figuration for the Great Acceleration rather than a literal tracing of the Earth. From the pig farm, Feral Atlas discusses antibiotics and bacteria that evolve in the antibiotic stew. From the nuclear plant, we discuss spreading radioactivity far beyond the plant. And from the plantations, we'll discuss agricultural chemicals and the organisms they encourage. All of this builds up to a method, and that's what I'll introduce today. Social science and humanists, as well as artists, have shied away from difficult environmental stories. And part of the challenge I'm addressing in this talk is how to tell terrible stories in such a way that, far from being paralyzed, listeners might want to get inside to get at the details. So when I refer to the more than human Anthropocene, I don't just mean that non-humans are caught up with humans in environmental challenges ranging from global warming to the extinction crisis. I mean something much stronger and more frightening. We humans have non-human collaborators in making the ecological disasters we call Anthropocene. These collaborations are not about making common cause together. On the contrary, the kinds of collaborations I'm interested in today make the world less habitable for humans as well as many of the other species we've lived with since our origin. These collaborators are out of human control, even as they're completely entwined with human projects of planetary transformation. These collaborators are enabled by human-made landscape transformation projects I'll call infrastructures. We'd better learn something about them. I use the term feral to describe the practices of anthropogenically enabled but out of control non-humans. My lecture today uses materials from Feral Atlas compiled together with Jennifer Dager, Alder Kellerman Saxena, and Fei-Fei Zhou. Feral ecologies are a vivid example of human and non-human historical timelines woven together. As biologist Steve Topalovic has pointed out, human landscape transformations are the single most powerful force in the evolution of living things today. He's not talking about the work of genetic laboratories, but rather the out of human control evolution of herbicide-resistant weeds, newly empowered invasive species, host-shifting livestock pathogens, and that's just a few. Even basic descriptions of such phenomena require studying both human and non-human histories, and for this, it becomes essential to overcome the human exceptionalism of the social sciences on the one hand, and the anti-humanism of the natural sciences on the other. This separation blocks our study of the Anthropocene. What of the role of artists and architects, humanists, and social scientists in addressing these problems? I'm going to argue today that we need better description of the Anthropocene. When humanists and social scientists first heard the term Anthropocene, our collective reaction was to use our strengths in language and philosophy to focus on the concept and its inadequacies. I might have done so myself 10 years ago, but I had the privilege for 5 years of co-directing Aarhus University Research on the Anthropocene, or AURA, a program at whose heart were conversations among biologists, anthropologists, and artists about the conditions of living on Earth. We eschewed the misleading scientism of most 20th century collaborations across that line, as well as the philosophical grenades of the science wars. Instead, we began with the curiosity and passion of field observation, which field biologists, anthropologists, and artists share. What do we learn from field work, we asked. In monthly seminars, we read together across disciplinary lines, putting into practice a slow science, in Isabel Stenger's terms, that asks what matters in designing research. From both our repeated misunderstandings and our fragile work in common, I began to see how empirical study of the more than human Anthropocene might emerge. Feral Atlas is an AURA project. It gathers about 100 reports and essays by natural scientists, social scientists, humanists, and artists, and with a big role for architects, in a digital format that combines features of a scholarly book, an archive, a game, and a meditation on living together with others. I use it today as a gateway to thinking about how we might best narrate the Anthropocene. Narration and description involves more than adding data to an already known set of understandings. Anthropologists, for example, can do better than studying people's reaction to climate change, as if we already knew what climate change was from the natural sciences. Instead, a more than human environmental humanities remakes climate change and other Anthropocene phenomena as research objects. This is not just disciplinary hubris. This is how we might arrive at better description. This is worthwhile to address the big question of the Anthropocene. Will we and our species companions be able to live on this new Earth we're making together? This is the question of more than human livability. Through histories of humans together with non-humans, questions of inequality and social justice among humans enter discussions of the environment. More than human concerns should be central to studies of the conditions under which some people have been considered less than human. From public health, indigenous rights, and food justice to sheer survival, human mobilizations need more attention, not less, to non-humans. In what follows, I'll offer some methods for studying the more than human Anthropocene. Methods are theories in action, that is, theories that work with empirical materials. And I'll offer a series of frames within which concrete problems of the Anthropocene might be addressed. First, treat the Anthropocene as patchy, that is, as composed, heterogeneous social and ecological patches, spaces, and corridors. I'm suggesting that the Anthropocene requires spatial as well as temporal analysis. Anthropocene effects are the results of human projects, which change the forms and structures of land, water, and atmosphere. And they don't do so in an undifferentiated way, despite the fact that sometimes they have planetary impacts. Instead, they form patches. The uniformly distributed planetary Anthropocene is a result of a particular set of methods involving modeling big data sets. Those models are useful, and I'm in their debt for mobilizing both public and scholarly interest in the health of our planet. But we need more than those models. We need methods that can show us both human and non-human heterogeneity and the structures of inequality and violence that explain how Anthropocene effects develop in the first place. Consider climate change caused by anthropogenic carbon dioxide, the first thing that comes to mind when many people think about the Anthropocene, and a problem that we unreflexively imagine as uniformly planetary. But every diagram of the carbon cycle shows us patches as well as mass effects. Take this one, which I've randomly pulled off of the internet. On the right is a factory burning fossil fuels and creating a dense patch of carbon dioxide, which spreads through the atmosphere. On the left is a forest, which captures some of that carbon dioxide for planet respiration. These are patches, as are the ocean levels depicted below. A faithful description of carbon dioxide production and circulation requires attention to the industrial landscape structures and infrastructures that spread and sequester carbon dioxide. Carbon. Field-based social and natural scientists know something about the relationship between places and the matrices in which they're embedded. This is a portal for empirical study of the Anthropocene. In Feral Atlas, geologist Jan Zalazevich and artist Anne-Sophie Milon make carbon dioxide as palpable as possible in the Milon painting, where the purple haze shows its bulk and weight. Zalazevich introduces feral carbon dioxide as a traveling mass, a clot produced in particular places and moving through air and water with a particular time span before it disperses. He points to the specificity of its victims, whether in tropical coral reefs or boreal forests. By bringing carbon dioxide to the field, the authors materialize its production, travel, and effects. This can move us towards Patchy Anthropocene. What makes carbon dioxide-rich patches is, of course, industrial infrastructures which burn fossil fuels. Attention to such infrastructures shows us a lot about patches of the Anthropocene. And I'm using the term infrastructure to refer to land, water, and atmosphere altering projects, as these range from plantations to factories to international shipping. I do not mean networks for moving things around, one common meaning of the term in anthropology, but something closer to public works, that is, material elements of governance projects. In this meaning of the term, imperial and industrial infrastructures create unprecedented patches of feral effects. Feral is not necessarily negative. We need feral forests growing up on abandoned farms, just to give one example. The Holocene was full of feral effects. Still, discussion of the Anthropocene guides our attention to dangerous feralities. The feral effects of industrial and imperial infrastructures are the Anthropocene in all its terrors. Consider this example from Marija Weiss, a scientist at the Harvard Forest. Weiss writes for Feral Atlas about insects that travel with wooden shipping pallets, such as the emerald ash borer pictured here, which is killing millions of American ashes. Weiss explains, devastating infestations traceable to wood pallets threaten to remake U.S. forests at an unprecedented rate, and yet with unknown consequences. She explains the infrastructure. The solid wood shipping pallet is so ubiquitous that it's become nearly invisible, but pallets are at the heart of the global shipping industry that's defined the modern economy. There are now approximately 2 billion pallets in circulation in the U.S., and around 94% of all U.S. goods once sat atop their slats. Weiss tells the story of the development of wooden shipping pallets as an American military technology during World War II, and their spread afterwards at the heart of commercial shipping. She writes, pallets became indispensable because they facilitated fast transfers of goods from ships to trains to trucks. Pallets were at the heart of the American post-war consumer boom, and they've continued to play a central role in the exponential growth of international trade over the last 70 years. I'm using an example of infrastructure here that does have a network feature, but note that my point about infrastructure has to do with its material manifestation. Weiss writes, Let's begin with the ecosystems of the wood itself, specifically who or what is living in the source wood. Pallets move the world, says Mark White, director of the Pallet and Container Research Laboratory. But the world they move includes more than just consumer goods. Pallets also move the live insects and plant diseases that are part of their home ecosystem, exposing trees at their destinations to novel threats. This problem, she argues, intensified at the end of the 20th century as American companies moved manufacturing abroad and most goods in the U.S. traveled from distant ports on pallets from widely distributed forests. The sheer scale of insect introduction, she argues, ensures that some insects will find a foothold in American forests where they will proceed to kill off the trees, as well as the plants and animals the trees support. Weiss nicely explains one of my key arguments. Non-human makers of the Anthropocene are entities that take advantage of the affordances of human infrastructures. Insects use shipping pallets to find new homes. In the process, they change forests completely, sometimes wiping them out. This is the more than human Anthropocene of feral effects. Insects here are our feral entities, our Anthropocene co-conspirators. Shipping pallets are the infrastructure that remakes them as forest killers. The study of the Anthropocene should begin with infrastructures and the beings remade through these infrastructures, like emerald ash borers destroying American forests. As the shipping pallet example shows, infrastructures are not just random bits of technological wizardry. They develop within the violence of political economies and cultural programs. In Feral Atlas, we've stressed the importance of 4 programs for infrastructural development: invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration. We call these Anthropocene detonators because they set off forms of the Anthropocene through new kinds of infrastructural development. These detonators are set off by historical events, but they do not periodize history. And this is not a chronology. All of these 4 are very much with us in the present. While our invasion program begins with the European invasion of the Americas some 500 years ago, it continues today in all forms of settler colonialism. We consider thoughtless biological introductions, such as the rosy wolf snail in Hawaii, which is eating native snails to extinction, to be part of contemporary settler colonialism. Similarly, long-distance elite governance pioneered in European colonialism continues in most major infrastructures today. Shipping pallets, described by Weiss as a military application, have empire in them. But pallets are also creatures of capital, the program that turns human and non-human work into resources for distant investors. Acceleration, by which we refer to the post-World War II Great Acceleration, spreads and democratizes imperial and industrial programs so that people everywhere have a chance to take their turn in destroying the earth. Acceleration also has its distinctive infrastructure varieties, especially those involving waste management or lack thereof of long-lived materials such as plastics and radioactivity. In her book, Plutopia, historian Kate Brown showed how American social arrangements of race and gender helped to construct both the imagined safety and the negligent waste disposal of the global Great Acceleration. In Feral Atlas, she continues to map our times in showing how Chernobyl has gone global through blueberry picking. Here's an excerpt. The berry pickers ride along on bicycles or pile out of cargo vans. They're young, mostly women and children, lean, suntanned with hands stained deep purple. Since the Chernobyl nuclear accident in 1986, rural communities in northern Ukraine and southern Belarus have been struggling to make ends meet. Since the late 2010s, surprisingly, towns of the Polisia region in northern Ukraine have become boom towns. What's charging the local economy? The mass harvesting of wild organic berries and mushrooms from the marshy forests. This is the new local economy that enriches the global diet with radioactive cesium from the 1986 Chernobyl accident. The pickers know the forest and where to find its fruits ancestrally. In this territory of mineral-poor soils, plows and wheat farming never thrived. Polisians instead have subsisted on forest products, game, fish, berries, herbs, and mushrooms. What's new in the past few years is the industrial-sized scale of berry picking and harvesting. Hundreds of buyers line the roads, and each buyer purchases a couple of tons of berries a day in the high season. Ukraine's export to Europe of wild organic Polesian berries has increased more than 30 times since 2014. Ukraine has surpassed Canada as the largest exporter of berries to the European Union. After the blueberry season, pickers return to the forest in August for cranberries and in the rainy autumn for mushrooms. Buyers sell the day's purchase to a wholesaler at a large warehouse. There, a radiation monitor swings a wand over the dark purple berries studded with small emerald leaves. Ja, she repeats, indicating that the berry's count of radioactive energy measures over the permissible level. Half of the berries ended in the stacks above the permissible dose. The warehouse buyer purchases all the berries. They purchase the above permissible berries at lower prices. Mixing high-count berries with cleaner berries, the wholesalers reach the US and EU threshold of 1250 becquerel per kilogram. Long before Chernobyl's fourth reactor blew, scientists understood that Polesian swampland, with its dense tangle of bogs, streams, lakes, and quagmire, were very good at recirculating radioactive isotopes and channeling them towards mineral-starved plants, which hungrily drank up radioactive isotopes that mimicked minerals needed to survive. Berries and mushrooms are classic forest products because they take what they can from forest ground. Polesians, also classic forest dwellers, have learned to do the same. Many international agencies tried to devise programs to revitalize the Chernobyl-affected economies. They failed. No one ever recommended jump-starting the local economy by harvesting the most radioactive Chernobyl byproduct, but then few consulted with Polesians about how to proceed after nuclear disaster. Abandoned to their fate in battling the world's greatest technological disaster, Polesians have learned to make do as best they can. That's the end of the quote. Here, the feral entity is radioactivity itself. Emerging from a nuclear power plant, that's our infrastructure, radioactivity goes off in its own directions, entering the metabolism of plants, fungi, and animals. The Anthropocene, again, is a feral effect, an effect of more than human action. Brown concludes with a story about Chernobyl blueberries in the North American blueberry trade. A truck was stopped at the US-Canada border because it carried a large radioactive mass. It turned out to be Chernobyl blueberries, at which point the Border Patrol let it in, since there is nothing illegal about selling radioactive blueberries. I checked my own freezer and found a package of frozen organic wild blueberries that said, packed in Maine. Infrastructures show us landscape structure, that is, the forms through which Anthropocene patches come into being. In the corner here, you see a coffee plantation in Costa Rica. By killing off all the other plants and allowing only coffee, the owners have created a plantation monoculture, which, according to agroecologist Yvette Perfecto, encourages plant pests and diseases such as coffee rust fungus. This is not the only way to grow coffee. Central American small farmers plant coffee under shade and together with a variety of other plants. Unfortunately, plantations like the one you see in the photo have attracted enough disease organisms causing an epidemic. The disease spreads beyond the plantation into smallholder orchards and farms. To understand the situation, one needs to start with what I'm calling landscape structure, that is, iterable patterns of human disturbance. Here, the monocrop coffee plantation. The plantation is a structure that gives specificity to this bit of turf. The Anthropocene problem of spreading plant diseases can be studied only in relation to this landscape structure. Imperial and industrial infrastructures do kinds of work that humans have always done, but with a difference. There's a rift, a betrayal between ordinary human ways of doing things and the great infrastructures of invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration. In Feral Atlas, we try to get at this rift through a concept we call tippers, modes of infrastructure-mediated state change. These describe a shift in register, a break with vernacular practice offered by imperial and industrial infrastructure. Here, the plantation orders and simplifies coffee production. We call this technique grid. Organizing crops is also what you do when you plant vegetables in your garden. But something is different. The heritage of the full-sun coffee monoculture in Latin America is the European-sponsored New World plantation, in which ecologies were simplified to make use of coerced human labor, labor grabbed through enslavement. The simplification of crops was built for a system of alienation in which laborers could not be expected to pay attention to a multiplicity of plant rhythms. The plantation packaged human alienation with ecological alienation, in which crop plants were separated from their companion species for a uniform forced reproduction. It's within this legacy that growing coffee in full sun as a monoculture opens the coffee to coffee rust fungus. All plantations are like this. Indeed, it's tempting to think of ecological alienation as an inherently pathogen-attracting state. The simplification of the ecology that goes into a plantation gathers and nurtures diseases and even breeds new ones. This is the betrayal of grid. Through infrastructural state changes, here, grid, Feral Atlas puts the betrayal of the coffee plantation into dialogue with other forms of infrastructural violence. John Bellamy Foster has popularized as Marx's concept of the metabolic rift to describe how capitalist agriculture depletes soils by moving nutrients from the countryside to the city. This is one way to describe the betrayals that emerge from industrial infrastructures. Each of the infrastructural complexes we describe in Feral Atlas offers its own forms of metabolic rift. The plantation betrays the small farm by nurturing disease. Global trade through shipping pallets betrays everyday exchanges by swamping forests with potentially invasive pests. In each case, infrastructures bring us to landscape structures that show how these metabolic rifts are enacted. The plantation is a good example because its morphological difference from a peasant farm makes the landscape structure of betrayal, the ecologically dangerous monoculture, quite clear. How big is a patch of landscape structure a scholar should study? This depends entirely on the phenomenon on which you're looking. If you study coffee rust fungus, you must follow the rust to where it goes. You can't pick out the scale in advance. Rather than setting the term, scale emerges from the problems associated with landscape structure. Remember the insects that travel in wooden shipping pallets? The patches that emerge from the relation between traveling insects and shipping pallets are the corridors of global shipping. Note how these routes privilege particular port cities. Invasive insect pests often find their footing in port cities and travel much more slowly out from those points. Here, landscape structure differentiates ports and places inland. What about Chernobyl's radioactive blueberries? Chernobyl's plume of radiocesium swept out with the winds across Europe and Asia. This plume offers one level of landscape structure. Plants, animals, and fungi within this plume are likely to be collecting radioactivity. But this is not enough to study radioactive blueberries. We need also the structure of the global blueberry trade, which transports the radioactivity to new locations. Perhaps it seems confusing to have to make a new scale for every problem, but once you get the hang of watching the infrastructure, it's not hard. If the infrastructure has to do with monoculture plantations, the patch structure you're looking for follows the plantation. If it has to do with the distribution of radioactivity, the landscape structure you need follows the radioactivity. Feral Atlas encourages researchers to try this out for many kinds of projects. What kinds of infrastructures are involved? What kinds of patches of landscape structure do they make? How are forms of coercion and discipline aimed at humans and non-humans intertwined? What are their feral consequences? We encourage young scholars and old to see how this opens research questions in what has been the no-go zone between natural science and the humanities. Before leaving landscape structure, let me tell you about one more Feral Atlas entry, plastic-eating cows in Karnataka. The patch here is the urban terrain through which dairy cows wander to find their food each day, and in which they rest, as in this photo, when they're tired. This is a mainly Hindu city, and people love cows and their milk. The cows are not feral. They're owned by city people who sell milk for the local dairy trade. It's the plastic that's feral, scattered on the streets, often containing food scraps available for anyone to take a bite. Geographer Kelsey Nagy found that given the choice, Karnataka cows prefer to eat food scraps, usually wrapped in plastic, over fresh grass. There are more calories and sweet tastes in the dumpster, but plastic seeps into bodies and into milk. Karnataka people prefer local milk, thinking of it as healthy, but dissolved plastic residues enter the milk. This is the feral action of the Anthropocene, and it's the landscape structure made by plastic waste that provides our best clue to the situation. But let me turn to my next method, co-temporality. All this means is that a lot of things are happening at the same time. This ought to be obvious. The only reason it isn't is that we've all been trained in a particular modernist ideology we call progress. In progress narratives, only one trajectory matters, and the one that leads us into the future. Everything else going around us is irrelevant. We learn to stop paying attention to everything except that one privileged trajectory we identified with progress. Non-human action, non-Western people, they were not part of progress. They were background for the history-making action of Western elites. This was a kind of blindness, and the Anthropocene is a reminder that it won't do anymore. We need to pay attention to the temporalities of many kinds of beings. They're making history just as we are. In the image here, all those bees are necessary to pollinate the plants that live in a particular valley in Colombia. However, commercial plantation agriculture is killing all of them off, except two. No one bothered to think about the other bees, the ones that cannot survive in plantations. They weren't part of progress. Well, now we have to start noticing. It turns out we need all those pollinators. Their world-making agendas matter too. It may be useful to look back on an earlier moment when social sciences brought up issues of co-temporality, but exclusively involving humans. Johannes Fabian wrote an influential book called Time and the Other, which was published in 1983. Fabian argued that while doing fieldwork, ethnographers shared a common sense of time with the people in the communities they studied. But when writing up their ethnographies, anthropologists placed those communities in a timelessness that denied their common histories with the writers. Even where anthropologists did not stereotype the people they studied as primitives, they created this savage slot once again by using an ethnographic present that denied time to the communities being studied. Those communities sat outside of history on some other shelf of time. Anthropologists thought themselves part of modern history, that is progress. People we studied were in some temporal limbo outside of progress. This would not do, Fabian argued. Anthropologists needed, he thought, to bring the people we work with back into the common time within which the anthropological encounters of fieldwork are possible. Let's extend this important insight to non-humans. We've developed habits of considering other beings as static, stuck in some same timeless space as the primitive. They too, we imagine, are outside of progress and therefore without time and history. We think of other species as having evolved a really long time ago, millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years ago. After that, we pretend they stay just the same, repeating their routines over and over. Just like primitive people, as imagined by progress-befuddled Westerners. In fact, non-humans are making history alongside humans. In many cases, we change together, human and non-human, at the same time scale. Sometimes their historicity changes everything, and not always in ways humans might like. We need to start paying attention. Anthropologist Paula Ebron took another look at the Atlantic slave trade in her entry for Feral Atlas. These drawings are representations of slave ships showing how African bodies, both above and below deck, were crowded and confined. The organization of immobilized bodies is relevant. What else was living on the slave ship? Ebron asked. What about the vermin, rats, lice, and mosquitoes, not to speak of viruses and bacteria? Once we start thinking with co-temporalities, all these creatures that live with human bodies, especially bodies chained in filth, become equally important as makers of the terrible history of slavery. Slave ships carried more than human bodies, and the experience of being carried across the Atlantic, so important for human histories to come, was equally important for non-human histories. Indeed, Ebron argues, it's impossible to understand the dehumanization of enslaved Africans without our attention to their more than human social relations. Non-human pests and pathogens worked alongside white planters and slave ship owners in creating the terrors called slavery. One fellow traveler really stands out, the mosquito, Aedes aegypti, which formed a new and particularly deadly population on these Atlantic voyages. In the Old World, there were several distinct populations of Aedes aegypti, which before the Atlantic trade was not found at all in the Americas. One population in the Mediterranean and North Africa learned to live closely with humans, breeding in human water containers and living in houses. Some scientists call this domestication, but if so, it's domestication for the purposes of mosquitoes. Many sailors in the transatlantic trade were from the Mediterranean, and perhaps the ships picked up this population there. But while loading enslaved people in West African ports, a different Aedes aegypti population was encountered, and this one carried the yellow fever virus. In this encounter, in the environment of the ships, a new and distinct population of Aedes aegypti emerged. It had the habit of living close to humans, plus an enhanced ability to transmit yellow fever. It was something original. All Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in the New World are descended from this immigrant population. It is neither African nor Mediterranean, but something emerging from the ships, and it proved to be most deadly. The plantations to which enslaved Africans were brought turned out to be great places for the new mosquito, with water containers for breeding and plenty of people for blood meals. Yellow fever went crazy, changing the course of history. Historian John McNeill has argued that empires stayed and departed because of the mosquito. Ebron shows the mosquito's importance for the southeastern U.S. area known for an African gullah culture. Because white planters were afraid to settle there because of the fevers, Africans had more autonomy there than elsewhere in North America, and gullah culture developed from this autonomy. This mosquito made history, indeed a terrible history, as part of its co-temporality with slave ship owners. It wasn't just transported, it changed in the voyage. Today, this is our Zika carrier. Please don't misinterpret me. I'm not comparing enslaved people to insects. On the contrary, I'm arguing that the bravery, suffering, and survivance of enslaved people requires attention to the evolution of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes joined slave owners in terrorizing kidnapped Africans. Mosquitoes and slave owners have entangled timelines. The history of slavery is also the history of mosquito evolution, and vice versa. But of course, mosquito lives are much shorter than human lives, and this matters in terms of how each species handles change. Mosquitoes evolved new virulent populations, while white planters were still tinkering with roots for shipping Africans as property. Attention to co-temporalities brings us into differences across species. In contrast to humans and to insects, trees have very long lives. The killing effectiveness of invasive insects, such as those that travel with wooden shipping pallets, has to do with the inability of trees to work out quick responses to the new insect threats. As for radioactive cesium, it has a half-life of more than 30 years, and that only under laboratory conditions. Under ecological conditions, radiation recycled by organic materials and moving around in the soil sticks around a lot longer. Blueberry fruits are short-lived, but radioactivity bioaccumulates in animals such as humans. As we work across temporalities, all these issues must be brought into play. Through coordinations within co-temporalities, more than human histories are made. One of the reasons we designed Feral Atlas as a digital project is that it allows users to travel back and forth across cases and scales in some of the ways I'm doing now, to consider how feral dynamics pile up, overlap, and differentiate across landscape structures. Thinking with co-temporalities allows us to notice the radical discrepancies across varied kinds of being, and yet we need to think back and forth among them to know the patches and links of the Anthropocene. The same point might be made about kinds of human knowledge of the Anthropocene. The contributors to Feral Atlas bring radically different forms of knowledge making and experience to their entries for the project. The digital architecture lets users move back and forth among entries, trying out lines of comparison and contrast without homogenizing them into a uniform frame. In this way, a digital framework seems ideal for addressing the dilemmas of representation after progress. The wild multiplicity of historical actors, each quite different from the others, can come into play through users' movement through the digital frameworks of Feral Atlas. But why do we call it an atlas? This brings me to our interpretation of mapping. The image you see is a map of an elm tree from the perspective of an elm bark beetle. Bark beetles carve galleries into the wood under the bark as places to eat and to lay their eggs. What you see is an artist's representation of some of those galleries, which to me look like the streets of a city. It's a map for Feral Atlas because it offers one piece of the landscape structure of an important pathogen, Dutch elm disease, which has wiped out many of the elms of both North America and Europe. Elm bark beetles carry the fungus not only across the tree, but from one tree to another. Without the beetles, the fungus cannot make it to a new tree. At one level, then, the landscape structure of the pathogen is defined by the movements of the beetle. Beetle galleries offer a map in Feral Atlas because their representation gives us spatial information. The maps Feral Atlas offer do not fit together on a common scale. Indeed, that common GIS scale, we argue, is misleading, often hiding its gaps and mistakes in the false artistry of standardization. Feral Atlas offers two versions of the story of Dutch elm disease. One is a personal memoir about the sudden death of elms in the UK in the 1970s, which completely changed the home of the writer, for whom these trees were an aspect of her identity. The other is a biologist's report about the forms of travel and hybridization that allowed the fungus unprecedented new virulence. The atlas juxtaposes these two pieces of writing, both offering the authority of evidence-based knowledge, despite sharp differences in both ontologies and epistemologies. Just as we refuse to standardize the maps in the atlas, we refuse to standardize the entries. We take hold of Eduardo Viveros de Castro's ontological anarchy. We embrace radical difference as a feature of telling the Anthropocene. To show what I mean, let me introduce one more map. Russell Ngadiali Ashley, an Australian Aboriginal artist, made this map for us in relation to his people and the invasive cane toad, which has blanketed northern Australia. His clan are the goanna lizards, which eat frogs. Cane toads have poison glands in their necks. Predators die when they seize the toads before enjoying a single bite. Goanna lizards are disappearing from Ashley's home place. He writes, "Before, goannas were here forever. In the olden days, people spent time hunting them. Now a stranger has come. White fellows call him cane toad. We don't know him or where he's from. But he came and killed animals, including janda, the goanna. Now we can eat only kangaroo, emu, turtle, and some crocodile. No more janda." When Yolngu Aboriginal people went looking for janda and found so many dead, they started crying for him. They still feel great sorrow. We always sing and dance janda at ceremony. Yolngu have law for janda. See all those Yolngu sitting around singing about janda. You can see old men with spears, people singing, playing yidaki, didgeridoo, and blima clapstick. Women are dancing. They do this because Janda is their dreaming, and Madayan, their law, and their sacred identity. Yungu are worried. We have ceremonies and stories for Janda, but the cane toad came in their secret way, and then they speared the goannas and other animals dead with the poison spear. We still have the law. We can dance for Janda, but they're gone. We still got law. We can't forget. We can't forget about Janda or any goanna. Goanna is what in the United States we call monitor lizard. The cane toads are at the bottom of the map, which I've enlarged here on the right, facing the men with spears who are trying to keep them out as the people celebrate the goannas. People are singing. People are crying. This is a map because it's a representation of the relation between people and country. Related kinds of maps have been used in Australian land right legal cases. If it stretches the idea of the map, that is indeed the point. Ashley's map illuminates one of the goals of Feral Atlas. Each entry presents first-hand evidence of how non-human feral action constitutes the Anthropocene. But the entries are not alike in many ways, including authors' relations to their materials. The entries reach out to each other across relations of difference. They sometimes refuse each other's logics. To bring them together without any expectation that they would form a single common map is our goal. And yet we do not leave the problem as worlds that never meet, east is east and west is west. Indeed, Ashley is already engaging in the work of comparison, writing for an audience beyond his mob and mixing several different languages. In Feral Atlas, we adopt and extend Ashley's stance. Through the digital architecture, we constantly try out overlaps, comparisons, lines of connection, and points of refusal. Together, these entries show us processes of structuring landscape, neither one single process nor disconnected separate worlds, but rather active world making with many players. This is the Anthropocene, both patchy and planetary. If the ways contributors imagine and make worlds differ, so much the better. Feral Atlas places entries side by side and comes up with a playful, performative apparatus for comparison and reflection. We do not ask contributors to synchronize their apparatuses for knowing the material. We hope users will find this difference at the heart of Feral Atlas and will use it to think about how a planetary phenomenon can be a system of partial coordinations. One last point then. Describing the Anthropocene requires playful and performative comparison across incompatible scales and processes, which together constitute the Patchy Anthropocene. Anthropologists have spent the last century worrying about whether there is any responsible way to do comparison with its colonial legacy. When I received my training, comparison was just not done. Good anthropology was single-site immersions. Then multi-sited anthropology came along, but mainly as a chain of related effects. Asking about the planetary while refusing methodological homogenization requires something else. I've been illustrating a comparative practice that does not add up to a coherent colonial authority. Perhaps this is feral comparison, that is, comparison that begins in imperial knowledge practices but refuses to stay in line. What kind of comparison is this? We're thinking of play and performance as the characteristics of our collection and comparison. Feral Atlas offers an improvisational performance comparison, not a timeless and authoritative sorting. Our collection and comparison are not intended as the final word. We see the project as a doorway that we open, hoping users will look out at potential paths beyond. Might there be new forms of research in which natural scientists and social scientists don't occupy different sides of a great divide? Might alternative ways to know Earth's patches show themselves as a part of a non-consensual whole? Feral Atlas opens such possibilities. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Anna. what an enjoyable lecture. Thank you so much. And well, I would like to just say that my background today is in the honor of Anna. I found an example of a feral struggle, which is the so-called fumigation in Singapore. It's a regular activity coordinated by the government. The entire Singapore landscape is fumigated due to the kind of danger and the threat of basically a dengue mosquito. And I lived in Singapore, and this is how our let's say garden in our complex looked precisely every 3 or 4 weeks when the fumigation takes place. So thank you so much, and I want to just let's say set the stage and for the discussion of also your involvement with designers, right? Because we are here, let's say, among architects, and this is I think hugely inspiring for our students and us that you have basically chosen to work on the Feral Atlas with architects, with some designers who were actively involved. And for us, of course, our discipline is not, to say so, constrained by the kind of scientific conventions. This is both in a way positive and perhaps negative, but I think design keeps a certain let's say, methodological anarchy, and I think that is at the core of it, as you noticed. But I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit more how your own, to say so, I think the kind of methodological anarchy developed in relation to perhaps the constraints of your own discipline, and how did you choose your collaborations? So how did, in terms of, let's say, production, in terms of intellectual constellation, how did Feral Atlas emerge actually? No, and perhaps this a little bit more on the link to design. I think this is interesting, and perhaps we will come back to it later in the discussion as well.
Should I go ahead and address some of that?
Yes, please. I mean, I have a couple of other questions, but I will save them for later. So that's
well, I can't help but start with fumigation in Singapore, because that dengue is spread by just the same mosquito that evolved on the slave ships. I mean, it's almost unbelievable that it's then other ships brought it from the Americas to Asia, where it became the carrier of dengue. And it's that, even though the old world was where these mosquitoes lived, they lived in trees in the forest, and it's this new kind of mosquito that evolved on the slave ship that's responsible for dengue in Asia. And so these stories kind of intertwine with each other. So I couldn't help but mention that. I also want to call out not just Fei-Fei Zhou, but also Lily Carr, a key, our map director for the Feral Atlas, who made a lot of what we're calling maps. I mean, you can see there are many, many different things, but we had designers from the beginning to the end really helping us conceptualize this. So there's sort of separate questions about how Feral Atlas emerged and how the kind of methodological anarchy, but I'll try and do them both. I mean, the good story about Feral Atlas is that it began really quite humbly as a kind of like a lab page it was going to be, with the research from our group in it. And then it just ballooned out, because everywhere I talked about this project, people would come up to me and say, can I join? I have a Feral Atlas story for you. And so we never let a call for papers out. It's just people kept volunteering when they heard about the stories. And I think if we turned it into the press a little over a year ago now, because they needed, 8 months for production. And if we had allowed it to go on longer, it would be twice the size, just because people were jumping on. Indeed, the press opened up a little gate last summer for us to put something about the COVID stuff, and we ended up with like 8 volunteers who wanted to write about it. So we got a lot of little COVID things in there. So that's how Feral Atlas emerged, and we did in the end write a section called Using Feral Atlas as a Verb, where we're encouraging users to figure out their own Feral Atlas stories. In terms of the methodological anarchy, that's something I'm committed to, the double thing of staying very close to empirical observation. I think there's certain kinds of art in the world that don't care about what the world's actually like. But in this project, one of the really distinctive features of this project is that we want every single entry to be as true as we know how to make it. That is based on firsthand observation, that we didn't even allow science journalism in the door because we didn't want people just interpreting other people's research results. We wanted people who had some commitment to the basic description of what's going on in the world through whatever methods. So in that way, it distinguishes us from lots of art projects where people feel like interpreting the world. We wanted to stay close to that kind of empirical materiality of the world. On the other hand, as I've discussed, we did not want all of the little pieces of that truth to add up to a singular, uniform, homogeneous, big truth. We wanted that granularity of radical difference to remain inside the project. And that became a really important principle of how we worked, and indeed in our rejection of GIS as the way everyone expected us to take a great big map and like put little pins in it where all the different places are. And we refused that. We argued that our maps are not going to add up to a single big map, but that instead we wanted those radical differences even in the trueness of each to be part of it, and that I would argue that we need to think about the planetary phenomenon of the Anthropocene in relation to those radical differences. And we can continue to talk about the design thing. That
absolutely.
Hopefully,
we will continue. We will continue. So I will certainly try more on the same theme.
Thank you, Anna, and I will just jump in after Milica and perhaps pick up on something you said. I mean, I think there's such a wealth of entry point into what you generously shared with us now that it's a little bit difficult to decide. It's a little bit like a buffet. So I would just want to pick up on the GIS scale conversation, because I think it also speaks a lot to, of course, planning disciplines, because this is kind of part of our everyday, and it's almost impossible to be critical, in fact, of the GIS scale. I think that there's also something that relates to the grounding of perhaps architecture and planning into, let's say, engineering, like frameworks. And I was wondering if there is, and maybe this is something that could be explored in another entry point. But first of all, what would you consider to be a good scale of entry into these questions? I personally wanted to enter some of my own work by looking at architectural detail because of the kind of materiality, and also putting into question the kind of solution-seeking imperative that was related to that. And at the same time, I think asking you about a larger kind of critique of technology, perhaps, and when you were talking about the Anthropocene as something that would need to be even discussed as a term. I think, of course, I was reminded of Catherine Yusuf's work on the kind of racial implications of the Anthropocene. I mean, she talks about white geology, and I think that this is something that our disciplines of planning have not yet tackled. So I'm sorry, this is a bit of a double question, but I think it could be nice for us to hear your thoughts on that.
I got 3 questions out of that, and let me see if I'm getting the right ones. And so we'll start with the technology thing, because I think, you know, one way of defining the era of modernization or something is that era in which we are asked to take on faith that the planners who roll out designs and blueprints for the world are telling us what will actually happen. That is, that you plan to build an office building, and that's what it'll be, an office building. You plan to build a road, and that's what it'll be, a road. And the problem with that is that no attention to that materiality, which necessarily has feral effects, has been built into the system at all. That we're just asked to kind of believe as a kind of true faith that whatever the boosters of a particular development project say is going to happen is all that's going to happen. And I think we're in big trouble if we continue that, and that you know, especially if you think of some of the big scale technological interventions that folks are thinking about in terms of climate change, you know, it's just the same. They're not thinking about feral effects. They're only thinking that whoever the planner is must be telling the truth. What's the good scale? That was the first question I got. And I really believe there that that we have to play with scale constantly to ask what processes we're looking at. And, you know, a friend was talking to me about this in a way that I found very convincing, is that if you wanted to ask what the right scale is to think of a disease, you can't know in advance, like it's going to be this city or this state or this country. You're going to have to look at where the disease is spreading and how it spreads. And that's, your scale is going to depend on the disease processes themselves. So some of it might be extremely tiny. You know, one of the great entries in Feral Atlas is about the kind of little critters that live in urban water systems after they've been chlorinated, and there's all these little animals that perfectly alive in there. So, you know, you have to look at a real detail to see something like that. And of course, other things are taking you, like those shipping routes across the planet in particular ways. Racial implications, that's a big deal, because it's essential that we bring questions of social justice and environmental well-being into the same frame of analysis. And there's so many forces that try and push us apart so that you're only allowed to deal with one or the other. It's either social justice or the environment. But I would argue that there isn't a single question where you wouldn't need to do both of these at the same time. And that, you know, that the field of environmental justice has really shown, for example, with industrial toxins, that in a place like the United States, industrial toxins are very unequally distributed in communities of people of color. And so industrial toxins, of course, is a worldwide problem, but it's patchy and unequally distributed. And so we need to start with patches in part so we can see how racial injustice works to structure environmental kinds of catastrophes of various sorts and problems of well-being. So my instinct there is to try and figure out better ways to pull together our work on social justice and on holding on to a livable environment, because these things, they just can't be separated. So that's a start on some of these issues.
Thanks. That's a wonderful way to enter these questions. I would perhaps take this chance to turn to our guests and ask Mary and Marić to jump in, and then we'll turn to Nick.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much for sharing this super inspiring project. I think it's also super important to show it somehow in the context of architectural school, where practically mapping and kind of drawing and cartography also represent our basic tools of communicating our ways of seeing in a way, and therefore also our ways of constructing and making, I would say, environment. And I think it's also super interesting that you talk about patching somehow in a context of architecture, and where I would say the problem and kind of dogma of universalizing very often kind of creeps in the surfaces around. I also have multiple questions, but maybe one to start with would be somehow this point of entry through storytelling, right? That you kind of really appears as an important part of the project. And somehow the way I see it, Feral Atlas in a way decentralizes the position of a storyteller, right? So there is no kind of clear authority of the map maker, and the reader rather appears as almost kind of flaneur, somebody who gets lost in this web of connections. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a couple of words, how does this collaborative part of the project actually between artists, scientists, anthropologists, architects, and kind of multiplicity of the ways of seeing, how does it actually embody also, the storytelling aspect, how does the story embody the worldview you're kind of trying to create through the map? Yeah.
Well, I thank you for those comments, which are so central to what we were trying to do as a project. And all I can do to begin an answer is maybe to give one example and some of the things that I learned from Fei-Fei Zhou, the architect who really kind of revolutionized the project with her vision. And that I learned, just as an example, she created these 4 landscapes for us that show what we call Anthropocene detonators, that is, historical conjunctures that detonate the Anthropocene. And what they are is they're collages of historical representations so they're fantastic in that they bring things together from many different places and times, but each piece is based on actual historical depiction of some sort or another. But she introduces these different perspectives into them, something I think is very central to training in architecture and design, but I hadn't thought about that way before. So that, for example, the invasion landscape is a long horizontal landscape that almost represents a journey from the invasion on the coast and going inland. And the empire landscape is seen from above as if the colonizers, as in so many historical paintings, are standing on a hill looking down on what they've conquered. And the capital landscape is a grid in which everything has been divided into, commodifiable bits. And I'm perhaps most creative of all when I tried to show, although I think the screenshot I used, not completely successful, but it's a clod of marine garbage that's weighing down on us, a world that's gone claustrophobic because suddenly we are wrapped in garbage. We can't get out of it. So each of those kinds of perspectives, it's what was so exciting about them to me, bringing them in, was a way to move beyond a kind of common ordering of everything, and yet also bring to life the empiricism, the historicity, the materiality, all of those parts that we wanted to. So I don't know if this is at least a beginning to the answer of some of these collaborations. And also, as I tried to show at the beginning of the talk, each one of them has further embedded collaborations from 2 indigenous artists in the invasion landscape, Ghanaian architect in the Empire collaboration, and the Filipinx artist in the acceleration collaboration. So this way of bringing in elements through a combination of perspective and collage and shifting scales, which again, I understand is something that you guys do in architecture school, but I hadn't thought about before. So it was really so helpful to me how you could see how the viewer is asked to move in and out of these landscapes. And again, we do that in the individual. So every report in the Feral Atlas starts with what we call a flow map, which is supposed to show how a feral process works. What are the dynamics of that feral process? So the representation, a spatial representation of some sort at the beginning is an attempt to bring you into that I showed you I talked about the entry about the plastic bags in Karnataka in a city in India, but the flow map is the researcher had documented where a particular cow walked in the city in a particular day and what was happening at these different points. So that's an attempt to see a flow map of how does garbage get into the belly of the cow. And so each of them represented a collaboration of some sort. And in that case, that was Fei-Fei Zhou working with the geographer who wrote that to make that map. In other cases, Lily Carr made a lot of the maps. Sometimes researchers wanted their own maps, but we, in each case, worked with them to ask what kind of feral dynamic is going on here and how could we best see that working in process. So the skills of design were absolutely essential and mind-blowing for me because I hadn't done that kind of work before.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this, sorry, Nils, just one more question and then I give the microphone to you. I mean, it brings, kind of to return to Charlotte's question, I think it really brings this question of scale somehow to the center point. I mean, I remember in your book, Friction, Ethnography of Global Connection, I'm probably going to misquote you now, but you say that scale is not something given, right? It's not like a neutral frame we use, but it's something we construct, we take for granted, we challenge, we somehow work with it, right? In that sense, Feral Atlas, I wonder, whether Feral Atlas is, with all these juxtapositions of scales, with kind of constructing the perspective, shifting the point of view at, each point of time, it's almost like an scale unmaking project, right? Maybe you can just reflect if you want briefly also on that part. Yeah.
Well, I think it's particularly important for something that we have so consistently thought of as planetary, so like climate change or the Anthropocene in general, that we, yes, pull apart that scale and see what does it actually consist of? That the planetary scale, don't get me wrong, it's very useful for some things, but then we start to take it so much for granted. And in anthropology, for example, so much anthropology of climate change there's this thing, planetary climate change. How do people here interpret it? But I'm saying that's not enough, that we need to ask, how is it constituted here, rather than just an already given thing that we can then view from different angles.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, maybe I jump in here. So I guess I can just repeat what has been said before. So it's really like an inspiring and fascinating project. And I just spent my weekend just browsing through the Feral Atlas, and it's really a nice way of getting lost. So I think I have two questions. Basically, one concerns the publishing project, and then the second one, the role of knowledge in the Feral Atlas. So for the first one, I was really fascinated by the publishing project as such, and also the way how you work collectively on that. And I just wonder if you could say a few more words, like from the editorial process. So what do you think? You said a lot about the advantages of having such a collective project, but also maybe you could reflect on the disadvantages as well. So you mentioned, like in our talk before, that, for instance, it's hard to get a review for that kind of project. And also I would be interested in what you would lose if you transform your website into a book now it's there. So is there something that would get lost, so to speak? And the second question might be a bit, because I'm not an architect and also not an anthropologist, but an historian, so it might be a bit of special interest question, but I wonder about the place of knowledge in the Anthropocene. So you just said that with the Feral Atlas, you want to get close to the empirical materiality of the world. And when I browsed through the Atlas, I found a lot of history-wise, I found a lot of environmental history in it, of course, because you're interested in the history of landscapes. I found a lot of history of technology because you're interested in infrastructures. But I wondered about the history of science. There was not so much history of science in it. And I wondered why, because, I mean, the Anthropocene is so knowledge-based. So you talk to biologists, geographers, anthropologists, and so on. So science is such an important resource for talking about the Anthropocene, especially if you talk about biological invasion. There's a long history, of course, of research in that. And so I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the history of science part. If it's maybe it was just a misreading that it's not in there, but I wondered if it was a conceptual decision or just maybe also a coincidence. Okay.
Thank you for both of those questions. And I think you're completely right that we have a lot of history of infrastructure or of landscapes, but not very much history of science. And I think it's because it was a reaction to some of what's been going on in the environmental humanities, which has been a big emphasis on the history of science and less emphasis, as if it were lesser somehow to describe the world than only to describe the conceptual apparatus for knowing the world. And I think both are important, but it was a moment of wanting to push forward to the description part to try and say this is not lesser and that we can hold on. I mean, what I think we do try and do is at least aim for critical apparatuses, for writing that is aware of some of the kinds of discussions about history of science, even if we're not presenting that as our major thing. So we're not trying to wipe out all of the scholarship on history of science, but instead to use it to say for the particular focus of how can we describe the world before that disappears. And because it also, you see the goal here of trying to get natural scientists and humanists into dialogue with each other. So it's part of that foregrounding is also an attempt to push that collaboration forward. So I think you're right. There's a lot that could be done with these same entries in terms of thinking about the history of science, but that would have to be future work. As for the publishing project, let me say there's a huge amount of work, but surprisingly delightful in terms of the energy and enthusiasm and the number of us that for unknown reasons just decide to throw ourselves at this project and to make it our atmosphere that we were breathing and sleeping and eating. So that part was really great. And then just the sheer number of people who jumped in and tried to do amazing things. As you said, the thing that's been the most disappointing is that after it was published, only then did I find that it's very hard to get a review for a digital publication and that the press isn't really willing to even shop it for reviews. And so I've been asking everybody I know to contact one reviewing publication and say, please review this. Because I think the material in here has both the public and scholarly insight of something that's printed on a piece of paper, even though it's a digital publication. And so it'll be, but it has a shorter shelf life, that technology will change and will mess this up. And so it's more important than ever that we get some reviews before the whole thing dies. So if anybody here is willing to write to any kind of general or scholarly specific publication to get us a review, I think it's not just a selfish thing, that we need to open those doors for the rest of you too, so that merely the medium of publication should not be a discrimination about how ideas are being made. In terms of making a book of it, it was a part of the initial agreement with Stanford University Press, who has this digital publication series, who did not say you will never get reviewed if you sign with us, but did say you are not allowed to write a book, that because of the experiment that they're trying and their willingness. I mean, I guess, the kudos to them are they're not making money off of this. This is an open access project. And so the agreement was that there would be no book. I don't know. It could be really interesting to try a book. My collaborator, Jennifer Dacre, who's a visual anthropologist, who did a beautiful book project, Phone and Spear. Check it out. I mean, in terms of use of design and the way that the book itself dazzles. There's some things that now have become possible with books where you can maintain some of the pleasures that you get with the digital medium.
Maybe just in line with this, would you say that Feral Atlas is also a form of an archive? Do you also see it as an archive, let's say, of kind of, and if yes, how do you, for example, make a connection between the media specificity, right, of the web platform that kind of communicates now this archive, the ephemerality also of the web format, right? So.
Yes. So the way that it's an archive, in my opinion, is that I'm hoping that research projects that were not thinking projects, art projects, whatever you want to call them, that were not conceived of, but during the making of Feral Atlas will be possible with it. So that sense of an archive, which is more than your average edited volume can do. Because edited volumes are short and they're often are special issues of a journal, they're often very oriented towards the approach, that here we're hoping there's material. So I tried it. I had to give a talk a few weeks ago for an environmental history conference about the city of Istanbul, which I don't actually know a lot about myself. But to try and work it, I thought, okay, let me do an experiment to use Feral Atlas in a way that it was not designed to do, which is to ask about cosmopolitanism and how you would ask about if there could be a more than human cosmopolitanism. So it was an interesting experiment for me to take something that I wasn't thinking about during Feral Atlas and to try and use the entries of Feral Atlas to push myself to think further about cosmopolitanism. So that's the way that it's an archive. But yes, there are ways that it is not a very good archive. I mean, let me say, the other thing that Stanford is giving us is an archived version, that is a version that won't work interactively very well, but will maintain the materials there with some kind of access to them. And I'm not quite sure what it will look like, but they're working on that now. But one of our entries, for example, from two Japanese scholars is about how the Japanese government authorized the use of radioactive materials from Fukushima to contractors who put them in parks and other kinds of places where maybe you wouldn't want radioactive materials. And they're doing this really fantastic citizen science project where they allow citizens to come in with soil samples and find out if some of those radioactive construction materials are in their town. I think it's a fantastic project, but when they approached us and said, well, we're looking for a place to archive all of that citizen science, to put all of that data that they're getting from all across Japan, we ended up deciding that Feral Atlas was probably not a good place for that, because of the ephemerality of the interactive site, and that it might not be a repository in that sense. So again, archive, hoping that people will do projects based on it, but not good as a repository.
It kind of also destabilizes a little bit the notion of the archive, right? This kind of collective effort, and then also this field, field kind of input. I think it really brings another layer, I would say, to the, yeah. Okay.
If I'm not sure I'm on, would it be okay if I asked one more question? Because
sure.
I mean, I'm aware that I'm taking the precious time of many, I'm sure half of the auditorium is burning to ask a question. So, but let's try this. I was really struck by this opening that you made about telling horrible stories and let's say having a method to tell terrible stories, no? And how to do that. And then the fact that you have brought designers on board, because of course designer, let's say a modernist designer, architect has been schooled. I mean, we are talking about creating new epistemologies against some, to say so, old epistemologies and old ways of doing, to say so, archives of knowledge and so on. And I think designer, at least the prototype of modernist designer, is somebody who was literally, as you described also, the figure who was, to say so, embellishing the ideology of progress. I mean, somebody who was literally making, collaborating in that ideology, right? And I think we are, as a educational environment, in the process of unlearning, or to say so, distantiating ourselves or finding our new grounds on which we are going to operate, And so I think everybody is aware of the kind of moment of destabilization in which we are, and I think searching for alternatives, right? And I think this is something that finally I can say as somebody who is part of the institution, that I think there is that moment of self-reflection, let's say, in the faculty, across the student body and so on. But I think that it's interesting that you say that we are perhaps in a phase of still, to say so, learning or facing, to say so, the critical narratives, right? Developing the critical narratives as a kind of a, let's say, reckoning, or to say so, understanding, understanding the feral, understanding that which was invisibilized, which was misunderstood. I think it was also called the kind of unintended consequences, let's say, of progress, of technology. I mean, famously the Green Revolution. I mean, many other examples. But let's say if we come back to the role of architects as those that should propose, I mean, that should also be able to articulate or to propose alternatives, or to at least be able to relate, to say so, the horrible story with possibly also an engaging or a motivating, or that which is, to say so, a kind of a common horizon, or let's say being able to address also the possible alternatives. So I'm asking essentially, are we still perhaps not at the right moment to tell the positive stories or the alternative stories? Are we not ready yet to articulate them? How does that work? I mean, I've heard a similar hypothesis from collaborators. So that there was a very interesting young architect, landscape architect, and collaborator with Bruno Latour, and she thought we are in the phase where we are careful, and we don't want to say so, to propose or to offer alternatives because we need to understand. No? So I think I'm wondering how this process, let's say feral atlas, right? Would there also be a moment where we are able to say so, to articulate alternatives as part of, or even a small site-specific moments, let's say, of of change, you know, and how would that be possible? No?
I thought you were asking one thing and turned into something else, and I may end up addressing some of the things I thought you were asking, even as I'll try and get back to where you came in the end. So let's start with what I thought you were asking was how might designers address some of these feral effects, and particularly the terrible ones, because I think that's a really creative challenge and not at all easy, and so therefore super exciting. So not an easy thing at all, it seems to me. I mean, just as an example, you know, we have an entry on the American bullfrog, which was sent out by development organizations around the world, supposedly to become a protein source for rural people all across the global south. Not too many people necessarily went to eat it, but they put all these bullfrogs in villages all around, and the bullfrogs jumped out of them, as every single report says, and, you know, when ate up all the local frogs and had other now parry diseases that are killing all the other frogs. So we really put our heads to finding a design representation for what was happening there. And we found hundreds of articles that showed us pens. You know, go onto Google Images, you can see frog pens. It's not hard to find the design of a frog pen, but not one of them shows feral effects. Not one of them, even though every single research article talks about these feral effects. The part of the reason that we have the bad idea that these are unintended consequences is because we don't know how to represent them in design, that the design continues to just show us the pen and assume that it's going to work. And so I mean, the reason I'm saying this is because I think it's a great challenge for designers to ask how we could represent these things in a way that could change consciousness. I mean, we ended up drawing a picture of a frog jumping out of a pen, but it was just a little painting because it was the only thing we could think of. But after looking at dozens and dozens of research articles, business articles, tourist articles, and not being able to find anything. So I'm not sure if that's where you were going at first, but I think it's a really important time for designers to think about ways of doing design that disallow this idea that all of these Anthropocene effects are unintentional. Because all unintentional means is that the boosters of a particular plan are pushing it under the rug. So most of these things are not unknown at this point. But now let me try and address the second thing, is like about telling hopeful stories. So first of all, there are a few very hopeful stories in Feral Atlas and a few completely ambivalent ones. An example of an unexpected hopeful story is the marabou storks that eat the garbage in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, and that even though all the city authorities really can't stand them because they poop on people's cars and lawns, that the scavengers who are out there in the dumps looking for, you know, metals and kind of hard materials are really happy that these birds come and eat all the organic materials off of them. So they're very grateful for the work of the birds, and they can also identify with being considered a pest by the authorities. So that's just an example. So I think in that sense, we need to keep our eyes open for, it's not all about the bad stuff. But before we start designing utopias, I think we need to look for, we need to, that first comment that I made, we need to look for the feral effects of the utopias that we constantly want to imagine. And then look instead for some of these hopeful stories that are in the cracks of even the terrible stories. I mean, where I live normally in California, these Argentine ants have become like this real pest that get into our houses in the winter, especially. And, you know, they come in thousands and thousands, and they're really annoying. But the biologist who wrote about them for us, Deborah Gordon, has found that in the countryside, those Argentine ants can get blocked by native ants. It's just in our houses, in cities and in suburbs that the Argentine ants are completely happy to take over and get rid of all the other ants. And so, I mean, that's just an example of where we're looking for these spaces that you can't exactly call it a utopia, but it's actually good to know that native ants are fighting back against an invasive species in the countryside. And so these cracks in even what seem to be terrible stories are also sources of hopeful alternatives, something like that. So I don't know, I mean, this might be strong enough for you, but I think the environmental news is generally really terrible. And that to the extent that we have creative passion for holding on to patches of livability, we need to learn how to put that passion towards some of the stories of things that don't work, as well as then looking for those patches where things are working.
Yeah. No, it makes actually perfect sense to me. I also can say that I think the book by Sartre, Imaginary, right? So addresses the origin of imagination, right? So where does imagination or let's say utopia or a kind of design idea come from? And he says, well, it comes from reality. It comes from the cracks of the observed reality, right? It's the only place where the imaginary can be born is from the real, right? There is nothing outside that, right? So this is to say, so the kind of recomposing the perception of the real in order for the idea to emerge, right? Literally in the cracks of that. So I think I really fully agree. I think it's a kind of a, not to say so rushing toward the imaginary, but really another, to say so deep look at the world. And I think with that commitment to what is there, with the renewed commitment, you know, to explore what is there, right? Under perhaps different terms.
Let me say too that it's so important in Feral Atlas that we don't say everything's terrible in the same way, right? Because I do think that protecting and nurturing those patches where we've got, you know, what you could call, a colleague of mine calls Holocene fragments, you know, that we need those multi-species kind of remaining environments. And in order to do that work of having these hopeful spaces, we need to see the granular differences across these landscape patches.
I think that there might be a question that would go further in this direction by one of our students. Shira, would you like to ask your question to Anna?
Thank you. I was curious about something you mentioned earlier, which is an important thing about Feral Atlas is to use it as a verb to consider these non-designed consequences alongside, you know, the infrastructural consequences we intend. And I was wondering, now that we're at kind of the end of our time in this lecture, if we could turn that onto this project as a whole, and for you to think a bit about, you know, what are some of the non-designed consequences that have happened as a result of this project. And I know it's in its kind of early public life from its launching. And so in that sense, maybe what are some of the non-designed consequences you hope will come from it?
Well, I mean, of course, the one non-designed consequence is not getting reviewed, right? So they're not all great. But I am very much hoping that it inspires people to look at feral phenomena around them and to, I mean, you know, if you guys as designers and architects could start thinking about design in relation to its feral consequences and how the kinds of work that you do might pay more attention to feral consequences, I would be completely delighted. I'm not sure that's fair as a feral effect, but I would love there to be kind of sister sites that come up as people play with these ideas. And, you know, one of the hosts was talking about making videos in class, and that, you know, some of the kinds of videos that we commissioned students could do, that I would love it if people ended up playing with these ideas and doing more with them. Yes, and so you could consider it a feral consequence if it ends up getting reviewed despite the sort of brick wall that we're running up against.
Thanks. I think that's a great point. I mean, I think we're willing at that point to probably use all of our networks to make sure that that thing gets reviewed. So I'm hopeful that this would be one of the undesigned consequences of this lecture, actually. I think there is another question from one of our students. Perhaps we could take that and then circle back to our respondents if they want to do that. So Elif, would you like to ask your question to Anna?
Sure. It's about the representation aspect of the Feral Atlas, and I'm curious to hear about the processes and decisions involved in the aesthetics of the site, the hand-drawn, the watercolored, and the illustrations. And connected to this is also the question of the audience and how a certain kind of visual can speak to different audiences in different contexts. For example, I'm speaking from the standpoint of an architecture student, and I'm curious about how you landed on this particular format and how all the factors that you mentioned of collaboration and interdisciplinary communication come into play with how the visuals manifested themselves.
So there's a couple of different answers about how the visuals came into play, and some of it's the sheer exuberance of collaboration itself. And I really am so grateful for the kinds of enthusiasm that we managed to collectively throw up, and so that people kind of volunteered stuff. And as you can see through the flow maps, that is the representations before each report, rather different aesthetics are involved in those flow maps. In terms of the work that Faye did together with the co-editors, I think, let me first of all refer you to her wonderful little article called Historical and Fantastic Landscapes that's in the reading room, and where she talks about some of the things that we collectively were thinking of as references, including the kind of Spring Festival, a very famous Chinese painting that shows a huge amount of detail at different scales, as well as a children's book by a Japanese artist, Anno's Journey. So that these are two, and I mean, I think in a way that bringing in that kind of Asian diaspora aesthetic was an important part of what we ended up accomplishing in some of those watercolor paintings, where it's not exactly Chinese or Japanese painting, but it has some of the liveliness that I associate with ink drawings, rather than necessarily just a kind of an outline of an animal or plant. So we were aiming for that liveliness. I don't know if this answers some of it, but I can't overemphasize the collaboration itself. I mean, you know, that the Manananggal monster that's in the acceleration thing came, when we got in touch with those artists, and they just got excited, and they had done an exhibit on the Manananggal, but figured out, how they wanted to entwine it with what we had already had there, with this mixed garbage, and that sense in each case of how the collaboration itself created a kind of flurry of different aesthetic decisions was very exciting to me.
Marija, would you like to pick up?
It's more like a thought. It's actually not a question, but as we talk, from this design position, kind of bringing in the design position, it really, the project really reminds me of how actually proposing a certain way of looking is already a form of design, right? So kind of, it's already something we construct. It's somehow about also losing the control, you know, like feral activities fall out of the design, outside of the design, right? So we practically, when you also say, you know, watching infrastructure, you know, this kind of something we would never probably as architects say, watching infrastructure, like this moment of slowness, right? And kind of, I think it really represents a very interesting counterpoint to some kind of normative values, I would say, that really cut across a lot of architectural discourse. So really being slow and just watching infrastructure as a form of creating knowledge. I think it's really very inspiring, I would say, to rethink built environment now through feral atlas kind of vocabulary, I would say. Yeah.
Well, you know, there's little videos, like Milica did a lot of them for us, but then we also got a bunch of other filmmakers and sound artists to watch in the very technical sense of infrastructure, you know, to aim a slow, steady camera at what was going on in a kind of infrastructural work. And I found that very, very interesting as a perspective from which to think about ferality and the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm. Nils, would you have another question perhaps for Anna, and then circling back to Milica as we would close the session?
Yeah, I think it's just a follow-up question basically on the political implications of this project, because what I really found interesting, like when you first look at it, there are a lot of concerns that are already really known from the environmental movement from the 1970s and 80s, like nuclear energy, destruction of landscapes and so on. But I feel that there's also a different way of engaging with environmental destruction than it was like 3 or 4 decades ago. So I think and that also has to do with scale. So a lot of these infrastructure problems are very local and regional, but I think you are also interested in these like global connections, if you will, between all these kind of local sites. So I wondered, so is there also an implication for political activism to act on which scale, maybe to take this kind of multi-scalar approach into activism, but maybe activism also includes design then, not just like the classical environmental actors. So I wonder if you could reflect on that. Yeah.
That's nice. That's a great way to think about it. And I do think the activism that we have needs to continually be looking for different kinds of allies that make a mobilization, you know, so that mobilizations work at different scales. And that is politically one of the kinds of things that we're trying to model how that's possible, so that concerns from very different places, different perspectives, and different scales could somehow find some common ground with each other. And how design could be a part of that. I think that's very cool to think about that issue, because I think, you know, while I came dedicated to this, I wouldn't have known how to put in practice the idea that design and the arts are not just illustrations, but they're argument in themselves, that they are part of what creating the kinds of knowledge that we need to have, as well as the mobilizations that we need to have. So I think very much that Feral Atlas is trying to argue that design is a part of, I mean, especially this problem of the particular and the planetary, that if we're going to have both at the same time, rather than just one or the other, we need design to help make that happen.
Great. I'm really, I have to say, quite inspired. So many things that you mentioned in the lecture and in the debate resonated. I would have to now look through my notes and highlight everything, but just the last sentence, the particular and the planetary, was already a kind of a huge, in huge resonance. I mean, the kind of watching slowly, for instance, or you know, design as let's say, as a figuration or design, as something that along other disciplines can help convey the feral aspect or change consciousness. So, you know, design to say so beyond utopia or before utopia or something like that. So I think really fabulous, I think also inspirations for the work that we do in our department and with students. And I would perhaps, you know, I just kind of almost don't dare to close because there are so many questions. So I will just go ahead and ask one more if you don't mind, and then we can perhaps, or you know, we take another 5 minutes of your generous time, and then we can close the session. I will just mention once again the GIS, right? And I mean, because you know, architect and urbanist and planners, so let's say those are perhaps the same kind of incarnations of the kind of designer role at in different, to say so, brackets of specialization. And I think of course technology is linked to certain ideologies, or let's say the use of technologies in particular way, right, is linked to certain, you know, ideologies, whether of you know, state or kind of political ideologies and so on. And I think designer, in order to move things forward, also has to, in a way, find the intelligent way to unearth or to expose, let's say, those ideologies, and to in that way also reflect on their own roles. So I think that somehow the intelligent reflection on those technological tools, but also the various you know, norms or frameworks that are inscribed in them, because they are so deeply pervasive in our profession, right? I think that could be also one of the, I mean, I think that perhaps, you know, we are in our own roles, professional roles, somehow, you know, there is a feral aspect between technology and ourselves, I would imagine somehow. And so I think that I am perhaps you know, asking myself, would there be a kind of a, or asking you on your further reflections on this, would there be, to say so, a kind of a creative and intelligent, let's say, unpacking of tools, you know, of architects that would be helpful in their let's say, feral research.
Sure, I think we need to have a critical relationship to all of the technologies, and especially those that seem so exciting that we can't keep our hands off of them, that the kind of dependence that we all have on the new kind of navigation through GIS systems, for example, is fantastic, right? You don't have to know anything and you can end up in a strange place. On the other hand, it's also full of pitfalls and invisibilities. And I mean, I'm tempted to tell a story from yesterday where some friends wanted to see if the morels might have come out. And so took me out, and they were using very high-tech things where you could actually see the terrain, and they had kind of backlogged where other people had reported morels in the past. And we did not find any morels. But part of what, you know, the advice was to find these dying ash trees. And I could see one of the things that all these technologies didn't show you is just when these ash trees were, you know, it's the story that I was telling of the emerald ash borer, that I'm in New England right now, where almost all the ash trees are dead. And some of them have been dead for quite some time. And so, you know, by the time you spool the temporalities that are bringing the morels up, all of the fancy technologies in the world did not help us find any morels. And I think in general, I mean, and maybe I'll tell the other part of the story too, that in the process of hiking around, I managed to lose my phone. And so it's a part of that story, right? Because we become so dependent on our phones, and then it drops out in a hiking trip where you're never going to find it again. And so it's a piece of the kinds of critical awareness that as we narrativize our relationship to the world, we can't allow ourselves to be completely subsumed in these new technologies. But can I ask a question before we run out of time?
Sure.
I want to know about territory, because I've encountered it like 3 different times, and it's not yet a tool in the world that I'm in. But all 3 times have been around design. So I know that this term territory has a particular kind of weight and force. And can I hear a little bit about the work that the term territory is doing?
Sure, I think Milica would be the one who's been the better place to fully answer. I also work with territories, but I think she can probably give you a more succinct answer. You're mute, but not if you're mute.
I think that the term territory, the way we use it here at ETH. So there is a particular, I would say, the kind of intellectual history around it that is very much present in Switzerland. There is also to say, so the roots go to Italy and to France. So if we speak about the kind of historically, we speak about the people such as Claude Raffestin and Michel Foucault, and also André Corbeau, the historian, urban historian. And I think these are people who have used the term territory to speak about different, to bring to say, so the space and landscape in relation to social practices, right? And I think in that sense, it links, I would say, the spatial phenomena with the social phenomena, including power, including the state, including scales, including regulations. So in a way, it's a helpful term to talk about, to say, so the layers of social reality, right? And I think in that, I mean, territory, of course, is socially constructed, but we also understand the more than human, let's say, life and ecologies as part, as intertwined, you know. So let's say the territory is, to say so, intertwined with the web of life, right? So in a way, it's simply a term that helps to be more, to say so, spatial and systematic, to say so, about space, if we can be somehow, right? So it's simply helpful. I find it helpful for designers. And I think we also want to address the fact that a lot of design has been, I think the kind of modernism in design has been city-centric, right? So it has been a lot about the focus on cities, about, you know, declaration of, let's say, an urban age, about, I mean, we are also in a kind of a historical trajectory where, you know, we say constantly that more and more people live in cities and let's say urban agglomerations. So the question is to say, so what is the relationship between cities and the non-cities, right? And or you know, that other space. And I think Kohlhaas also tried to address it with the kind of a countryside exhibition. So I think there is more and more focus in our discipline or awareness that we as architects have to look beyond the cities, right? So I think we, for the past few decades, you know, we've tried to sort of equalize the priorities, right? If we talk about the space of shipping, or if we talk about the feral effects, I mean, they are typically not in cities. I mean, they occur somewhere between the sites. And the sites, like a coffee plantation, is not the city. And those are precisely the places that architects have, you know, historically, traditionally not looked at, right? So in a way, territory helps us to go into that space, right? So that was the, you know, and we found, let's say, that to say so helpful history and some, you know, some body of writing that can kind of help us, help anchor us in that discourse. And of course, you are, you know, magically also, of course, really aligned with it.
I'm intrigued, and if you felt like sending me whatever you think the most important article is on territory, I would be grateful.
I would, yes, yes. I will do so. Yes, I'm so curious. I will do that. Fabulous.
Yeah, just to perhaps add one word. I mean, I mean, one of the aspects, for instance, that some of us also use territory is also in relation to political economy. So in a way, the way that political economy plays out on space and the organization of space and all the kind of political and economical and social mechanisms that are behind the production of space in a kind of organizational way. And but I think Milica did a wonderful job. I threw her under the bus, indeed, to answer that. But I think that was a wonderful way to also laid out, and I think it's clear that some of your approach, Anna, is very linked to these questions. I think both frictions and the mushroom at the end of the world was kind of also laying out, you know, this kind of very clear mechanisms that are related to how space is produced, and that is why I guess you have that fan club in the designers and architecture departments of the world.
I mean,
yes,
part of I mean, some of my friends and I have tried to revitalize the term landscape from landscape art kind of passive object to that kind of active mood where all this stuff is going on. So it would be interesting. I mean, we might not be able to do it here, to see the possibilities of territory on the one hand and landscape on the other.
Yeah, I mean, typically, let's say landscape is indeed more related to the kind of, let's say, pictorial traditions, to the representation.
Can be.
Of course, I fully understand that there is a movement, and it should be kind of freed up from that baggage. This is absolutely clear. And territory, of course, is more, I mean, let's say in its kind of etymology and a kind of a, let's say, intellectual, to say so, history. I mean, territory is more about power, about mapping, you know, about the territory is, to say so, more about the top view, whereas landscape was always more about the kind of a perspective. And also in terms of scale, I mean, territory was about you know, something which is much more easily scalable, to say so, than landscape, right? Okay. And so I think the truth or the ideal, I mean, of course, then there is a term such as land, right, which is something much more organic and somewhere in between. And Corbo, that I mentioned, he precisely sits there in between, using the term land. So in a way refuses both the territory and the landscape, right? So this is a kind of it's a very rich discussion. I feel closer to that meaning, the meaning of the term land, which is much more open, right? So in a way, the territory was somehow, it arrived to us from the context, but I think then we debate with students all those different shades of those meanings. And I think we use, I mean, we are in that sense methodological anarchists who you know, who use the term, you know, to construct the meaning that best supports, you know, the work that we want to do.
Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you so much. Yes.
I think we're bleeding participants. I think that people that are still here can be here, and everyone else is sad to leave but has something else going on. So we can close our session here. and thanking both Marija and Nils for joining us, of course, and Anna for so brilliantly helping us on closing these sessions on territory, which were one of the most enjoyable ones, I think, and also from my end, thank you, Milica, for making this with me and to everyone.
Thank you. It's also our moment to say goodbye, so it's a kind of a quite emotional.
Yes, and thank you to Hans for dealing with everything and being our all-time support in this adventure. So thank you very much, Anna, for joining, and it was really a pleasure. And we hope to maybe continue this conversation on I don't know, feral territories or whatever that could become. And thanks to all the participants who were able to make it until now.
Thank you all.
Thank you also.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Ciao.